So the wealth gap was created by the wealth accumulation. The wealthy are wealthy because they took it from you. So that is the basis of the wealth gap. I mean, you could say it in more sophisticated words, but the basis is you were robbed. And the solution has to be that we have to figure a way to stop the robbery. The robbery is still continuing.
Dr. Branch, can you talk about, share about the mindset of the community now? When we talk about this racial wealth gap, a lot of times in the Black community, we're consumer driven, right? You see the videos on Friday, on Black Fridays, where people are being trampled over purchasing material things. So if we're not really progressing the way we're supposed to, although we're, the number one consumers of fancy cars and fashion clothes, what's the mindset behind that?
Is this one? Yes. That's a great question. And so I'd like to push back against even that narrative. So Blacks are no more consumeristic than white folks. In fact, there are studies that show Black people are far more frugal than white people. And so we have to counter these narratives about us that paint us in a bad light. And so that's the crux of it with regard to the mindset. So yes, we do need to be collective in our mindset in terms of who we patronize and where we patronize, but I would suggest and push back against that narrative that it's not wholly true that Blacks or the consumeristic folks that society has made them out to be.
Interesting. Mr. Busby, being a business owner yourself and building yourself up, from the bootstraps, so to speak, can you just share just your perspective on what is it going to take for the majority of people of color to kind of develop and sustain successful businesses and kind of model the success that we've been having?
Well, first off, everybody's got a story. So my success is no different than anyone else's opportunity of success. I want to talk about the question that was posed earlier about African American spend. You hear a lot around the country talking about African Americans having $1 trillion of spend power, but typically that's not African Americans talking about it. It's typically white folk, corporate America saying, Black folk got $1 trillion, how can we get our piece of it? It's very seldom do we talk about the $1 trillion that we have to spend and how can we keep it within our communities. I owned a small business. I worked in corporate America for about 10 years, IBM, Xerox, and was a senior VP at Coca-Cola, and was 27 years old when I had my senior job. And I remember working about 90 days and was working from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. each day. And about 4 months into my career, my supervisor called me in and said, hey, Ron, I want you to pack your bags. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm getting ready to get fired. There was a white guy that was there that was about 56 years old. He had been working at Coke for about 30 years, about 25, 30 years, knew his customers extremely well, was very successful. And he said, Ron, we want you to move into Joe's office. And I said, well, where's Joe going? And he said, well, Joe's going to be reporting to you. At that moment, I decided I had to have an exit strategy. You see, I didn't want to be 56 years old reporting to a 27-year-old kid that was willing to work 4 more hours than me. And so I decided that I had to determine that there was going to be a plan for me in my life that was going to have me control my life and not someone else working 4 or 5 hours more than that. So at 27 years old, I moved back into the same bunk bed that I had when I was in the 3rd grade and went back home to be a janitor. I want you guys to understand this. My father had a janitorial service and he had 5 employees. My mother, my father, my 2 sisters, and me. The company was doing about $150,000 in annualized revenue when I moved back home and moved back into the same bunk bed that I had in the 3rd grade. But I had a vision of how I was going to become successful. And so my plan was to double my firm every year. And so for those of you that are in business or are thinking about going into business, I want you to do a couple things. One, think about an exit strategy the day you start your business. And it will change the way you look at your business, as opposed to just being a business owner. You're now training yourself to be an empire. And so to go from $150,000 to $300,000 wasn't that difficult. I wore a certain suit and tie every day, talked to a lot of clients. To go from $300,000 to $750,000 wasn't that difficult. I got to meet my mayor, got some local contracts. To go from $750,000 to 1.5 wasn't that difficult. I got into some city local government contracts. To go from 1.5 million to 3 million wasn't that difficult. I got into a program called the 8A program. And for those business owners, write that down. There is a government program set up just for the folk that are in this room called 8A. And it's a program set up for minority-owned businesses where you're only competing against other minority-owned businesses. And the day that I got certified, I went from bidding on contracts in the hundreds of thousands of dollars literally overnight to bidding on contracts in the millions of dollars. And from that day, I went from $3 million to a $7 million firm literally within about 45 days. And I got to $7 million, and I didn't know how I was going to get to 15. Now remember, I had worked at IBM, I had been a senior VP at Coca-Cola, I had worked at Xerox, and right down the street from Oakland, which where I lived, was San Jose, now called Silicon Valley. I was a janitorial firm at the time. I couldn't even get an interview to talk to the folk about emptying their trash. Couldn't even get a conversation about cleaning their restrooms. And so what I did is I ended up reading a book by one of my fraternity brothers called Why Should White Guys Have All the Fun? And for those of you that have never read the book or don't know about the story, that's the third thing I want you to do. Write that down, read that book. It can possibly change your life, because you see, Reginald Lewis was the first African-American billionaire, and he got there through acquisitions. And so for the next 6 months, I was in San Jose looking for a firm that met the criteria that I was looking for. And as I said, my mother was a minister, so she paraded a lot of nights with me and went from a $7.5 million firm to literally overnight a $22 million company. Don't tell me what God can't do. With vision, a lot of hard work, and I'm not going to tell anybody that it's easy, but you have to go in understanding what it is you're looking for. The other thing, I want all of us in this room, you see, a lot of white folks say, and black folk, there's this old myth that says white folk ice is colder than ours. And if those of you that are over 50 years old like myself, we've heard that story before. You see, there was this conversation that white folks' ice was colder than ours. Well, my grandfather used to deliver ice. And every Saturday he would go to, I know for y'all that are young don't know about ice boxes, but before there was refrigerators, there was ice boxes. And you used to get a block of ice delivered to your house. And typically that block of ice kept your fruits and meats and produces fresh for a week. So he'd get up early Saturday morning and take his ice to his white clients. And their ice lasted 7 days. But by the time he got to our neighborhoods, the ice had been melted down a little bit, chipped away a little bit, so our ice only lasted 5.5 days. But I tell my grandfather, Daddy Ray, I said, guess what? Because of a black man, we created the ice maker. So now ain't nobody's ice colder than ours. We can get chipped ice, cubed ice, flavored ice, colored ice. And when we start to see our businesses in that same vein, we don't have to worry about what other folk are doing.